Okay, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning, Rabbi.
Morning, Rabbi. So the Gemara that we learned yesterday was dealing with the contradiction. In the words of Beis Shammai, we in the end concluded that there must be two views in Beis Shammai. The Gemara used that as a last resort. Because we tried to reconcile these contradictions. The issue was that in one place, let me mute everyone. In one place, in one brisa, we found that Beis Shammai seemed to hold that the Berachas Hamazon, the grace after meal, does need to have a kois shel bracha, needs to have wine. Then in another place, Beis Shammai in the end of the Mishnah, it seemed pretty clear that Beis Shammai holds you do not need you don't need to recite the grace after meal on a cup of wine. Now, I do have to mention that this discussion may sound a little as if it's, what's the big deal? You need a cup of wine. You don't need a cup of wine. But you should know that it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, this view as well, that you need to have wine for the benching. And if you don't have wine for benching, you should not even eat the meal. There is such a view. You shouldn't eat if you don't have the wine to bench. So it does carry, very serious. It does have a serious application. It's not. It's not just it's ideal to have a cup of wine. No, this view holds you need to have a cup of wine. It's not just preferable, and in order to bench, you would actually have to fast. Now, what that means, it's similar to Havdalah. Why is it similar to Havdalah? Well, when it comes to Havdalah, if a person has no wine and they have no Chamar Medina, they don't have anything else that could be used as a substitute for wine. So there is a Gemara that mentions that one of the rabbis, a Maimar, he went to sleep hungry, fasting, because he knew that the next day he was going to get wine. But at night, he didn't have any wine, and he wasn't going to have wine at night. So it says he went to sleep fasting. What does that mean? That you can't eat anything if you don't make Havdalah. So a Maimar fasted. The Gemara learns from that story. You see from that story that you need to recite Havdalah in order to eat. So the same thing would apply according to this view that you need to recite the benching with a cup of wine, that if you don't have the wine, you should go to sleep hungry. So that's what it would, that is seemingly this view is comparing it to Havdalah in a certain sense. Now, with regard to Havdalah itself, the Tosfos asks a very strong question on our Gemara, because our Gemara, we're dealing with Beis Shammai here. Beis Shammai in the Brisa said that there's a whole order of how you do the Havdalah with the benching. You want to say grace after meal and do the spices and the fire. You only have one cup of wine. What do you do? So the Brisa said, in the way the Gemara understands it is, go eat your meal. Saturday night, you want to eat Malava Malka. The only thing is, you didn't do Havdalah, but you only have one cup of wine. So the Brisa says, you know what? Eat your meal, bench on your cup of wine, and continue with the other brachas of Havdalah on your cup of wine, and drink that one cup of wine, and it'll be good for the Havdalah, for the benching. And so what we're really telling the guy to do is really to eat before Havdalah. Now that sounds a little surprising, knowing that there's another Gemara that says that a Maimar went to sleep hungry because he didn't have wine. it sounds like it's more important not to eat before Havdalah than to have Malav Malka, because Amemar skipped Malav Malka. He did not eat the meal after Shabbos. That's called Malav Malka. That meal Amemar skipped because he didn't have wine. And now our Gemara seems to imply, no, you only have 1 cup of wine. And it's very important for you to do Havdalah and bench on a cup of wine. So what you need to do is eat your meal, recite the benching, and then the Havdalah, and all on 1 cup of wine. So what we're telling him to do is eat before Havdalah. That's what we're telling him to do. Taisa says, how can you do that? Amemar fasted. Yes, Robert.
I just want to confirm we're on 52, 52A
yeah,
or
52A.
B? Okay, great. Thank you.
52A. So this is a very strong question that Tosfos asks on our Gemara. Tosfos has a few answers. One of his answers is that if you know you're going to get a cup the next day, cup of wine, you actually have to fast. And you shouldn't eat Malav Malka. Recite Havdalah. And you're not supposed to eat before Havdalah. You're going to get a cup of wine the next day. Don't eat before Havdalah. Or, let's just word it that way. Don't eat before Havdalah. If you know you're getting a cup of wine the next day, you rely on the next day's cup of wine. And at night, just go to sleep hungry. Don't eat Malav Malka. Now, if you don't know that you're going to have wine tomorrow, that's when we tell you, okay, so you have 1 cup of wine. You're supposed to bench with a cup of wine. You're supposed to say Havdalah. In that case, we tell you, well, we're not going to make you fast more than a day. And it could be only until Chatzos, until midday the next day. So in the scenario of Amemar, the case was he knew he was going to get, or he trusted he was going to be able to get a cup of wine the next day. In our Gemara's case, our Tosefta's case, the brisa that we brought, here, he doesn't know that he's even going to have wine the next day. In that case, we tell him, fine, you can eat. It's better you should recite Havdalah with a cup of wine and bench with a cup of wine. And even though you're going to eat before Havdalah, but you might not get Havdalah the next day. You might not have a cup of wine. And you're going to miss out in benching on a cup of wine. So we tell you, well, if you don't know that you're going to for sure have a cup of wine the next day, don't wait. Recite Havdalah now and eat now, and even eat before the Havdalah. So what comes out is, if you know you're going to get a cup of wine the next day, you're not allowed to eat before Havdalah. If you don't know you're going to get a cup of wine the next day, then we tell you you can eat before Havdalah. And that is this case. Because you're not sure, you might not even get a cup of wine the next day. So in this case, you're not convinced. There's no guarantee that you're going to be able to have Havdalah in the next day. So therefore, you would be allowed to eat before Havdalah. In this scenario, especially because you want to bench with a cup of wine and so on. So we tell you eat, bench with a cup of wine, recite Havdalah, and even though you're eating before the Havdalah, it's okay. So it comes out that it's sort of like emergency. If you know you're going to get a cup of wine the next day, you're not an emergency really. But if you don't know you're going to get a cup of wine the next day, so who knows? You might get stuck without any wine at all. No problem. Here you're allowed to eat before Havdalah. That's one answer Tosfos gives. Another answer is that Amemar, we learn from that story you're not allowed to eat before Havdalah. Was Amemar overly strict, or was he following the letter of the law? So Tosfos wants to say, you see from the story that you're not supposed to eat before Havdalah. That you see clearly. Amemar went to sleep hungry. He didn't eat anything. Didn't even eat Malav Malka. He went to sleep hungry because he was going to get wine the next day. He didn't have wine. You see, you're not supposed to eat before Havdalah. But a Meimar was actually acting beyond the letter of the law, because the letter of the law only says that if you have wine, you should not eat before Havdalah. The letter of the law doesn't say you have to go to sleep hungry. If you have wine, you're not supposed to eat before Havdalah. Make Havdalah. Recite Havdalah first. But if you don't have wine, then you would be allowed to eat before Havdalah. You don't have any wine. You don't have wine, you could eat. But we're not going to tell you you can't eat. So according to this answer of Taishus, it comes out a little more lenient, that if you don't have wine, you really are allowed to. Meimar didn't. Meimar was extra strict. But according to the letter of the law, if you have wine, you're not allowed to eat before Havdalah. If you don't have wine, fine, you could eat. There's room to be lenient to eat before Havdalah. You don't have wine. So that would be a reason why our Brisa, our Tosefta, mentions, according to Beis Shammai, that a person should recite the benching, eat before the Havdalah, because he only has this one cup of wine and it's going to be going on both. So there's room for leniency if you don't have enough wine. In the case of Meimar, he was extra strict, but really he could have eaten before Havdalah. So that's the second answer of Tosfos. And then it seems that Tosfos gives a third answer. He doesn't emphasize it as a third answer, but some of the commentaries want to say that this is like a third answer of Tosfos, where Tosfos mentions that he holds that benching needs a cup of wine, and therefore you need to leave the cup of wine for the benching, which seems to be saying something to the effect of the fact that Beis Shammai holds that an extreme view that you need to have wine for benching. And because he holds this extreme view that you need to have wine for benching, therefore, Beis Shammai says it's even worth eating before Havdalah, because he holds of this, because you need to have a cup of wine for the benching. So the purpose of eating before Havdalah is in order to say the benching with a cup of wine. So the Brisa allows you to do this because of this mitzvah that you're going to get by eating you're doing the mitzvah in a preferable way. So you're allowed to eat before Havdalah, which means that under normal circumstances, you can't eat before Havdalah. But if you have like a mitzvah that you're doing, that would be the leniency here. So Meimar did not have a mitzvah that he was going to do. So he couldn't eat before Havdalah. I mean, you could say maybe the Malava Malka is sort of a mitzvah, but so it's sort of a question on this answer of Tosfos. But the Brisa allows this person to eat first and then to say the Havdalah and the benching on this cup of wine. If you wouldn't have such a option, in other words, to do this extra mitzvah, then you would need to wait, even if it means fasting, but you would have to wait for the next day. So because this opinion of the Brisa whole Berachas Hamazon needs a cup of wine, therefore you would you would eat before Havdalah and recite the Berachas Hamazon over the wine, and it would be considered acceptable. It does seem a little surprising. That was my question on this. Is it seems that Malava Malka is a mitzvah. Why would that not be a good enough reason to eat before Havdalah? In other words, he's saying, well, because he holds you need a cup of wine, So therefore, you could use the wine before Havdalah. It would seem maybe you could say the same thing for Malava Malka. See, what it seems like he's saying is the cup of wine for Havdalah and the Berchas Hamazon on a cup of wine seems to be of equal, somewhat similar importance. And he's saying because it's so important to have the Berchas Hamazon with the cup of wine, so therefore we're going to let you eat before Havdalah. Anyway, it's a third. It seems like it's a third answer of Taisus, but it deserves more interpretation of how exactly the third answer would fit. The first two answers are a little easier to understand, and they have to do with: is this a rule always that you cannot eat before Havdalah even if you don't have wine, or does it only apply if you have wine? You can't eat before Havdalah, but if you don't have any wine, then you can't. Or if you know you're going to have wine the next day, does that create more of a problem? And if you don't know, then you have more leniency. But there's definitely leniency to eat before Havdalah that we see in our Gemara, that there is such a leniency, and we're talking about a case where you don't have enough wine. Yes, Ben. Ben.
I think maybe the second reason was that the bracha, the blessing on Birkat Hamazon is so important to bless for the food that you're eating, that you cannot go without that blessing. Now you can go without the blessing according to the Maimon, but that's what I think they're trying to say here.
Something to the effect of that maybe it's more important to make benching on a cup of wine than to eat before Havdalah, than not to eat before Havdalah. That the benching on a cup of wine is more valuable than not to eat before Havdalah. Something to that effect. But I wonder how that works with eating Malava Malka. So I guess Malava Malka is less important, but benching with a cup of wine is more important.
Because blessing is the most important thing we do.
Right, Malava Malka is less strict. Okay, something along those lines. It's a little hard. Yeah, it deserves more. It would have been nice if Taisus added some words of explanation, but it is what it is. He wrote it in a cryptic way, so subject to interpretation a little. Yes, thank you, Ben, for developing that thought a little. So the bottom line is, so we have this contradiction. And the Gemara had different ways of trying to answer it, and then the Gemara, in the end, it said no, two different opinions. But what were the other options? Well, the first option was that the Mishnah says that Beis Shammai says you drink wine before benching because you don't need a cup of wine to bench on. That's what the Gemara initially thought it meant, and that would be a contradiction. Then the Gemara said no, you don't drink the wine before the benching. You actually drink the wine after the benching. You just say the bracha before the benching. The Gemara says, what do you mean? You're going to say a bracha before the benching and drink the wine afterwards? That you can't do that. A person who says a bracha is obligated to taste it. You can't just say a bracha, even though it's like a mitzvah bracha, because it's for the benching with a cup of wine, but you can't just say the bracha without drinking. So the Gemara answers, no, you drink a little. Then the Gemara said, well, what do you mean? If you drink a little from the cup, you are poigem the cup. You have blemished the cup, and you've made it unkosher to be used for a mitzvah. So the Gemara answered that it's not a problem. You didn't drink from the cup. You either put your finger in and licked your finger, or you poured a little on your finger and you licked it, but you basically drank a drop before the benching, and then you bench on the cup of wine. And the Gemara says, but doesn't the cup of wine need to have a measurement of a revius? If you pour some out, you're not going to have the measurement of a revius. Revius is somewhere around 3 ounces. And the Gemara says that no, it must be that he has more than 3 ounces. and therefore it's not a problem. He's still going to have a revius, even if he pours a little out. The Gemara says, but you said you only have 1 cup, and now you're telling me you have more than a cup. The Gemara answers, yeah, he doesn't have 2 cups. Really, the ideal would be to have 2 cups, so you could have 1 cup for the meal and 1 cup during the meal, 1 cup for the for the benching. And here, the case is that he has less than 2 cups, but he does have more than 1 cup. That's the way the Gemara wanted to answer it. And then the Gemara says, but this all doesn't fit because Reb Chia says clearly that he says the bracha on the wine before benching, and he drinks the wine before benching. He says clearly he drinks it. So it's not just taking a little taste of it. He's drinking the entire cup of wine before benching. Then where it concludes, you're right. Beis Shammai, according to one view, he holds you drink the wine before the benching. And the benching doesn't need a cup of wine. That's the way they're understanding it. That the benching doesn't need the wine before it's fine. He can drink the wine before the benching, and then bench without a cup of wine. That's the way Beis Shammai holds, according to this view, and that's the conclusion of the Gemara. The question is, so what is the real, what's the logic behind Beis Shammai? You got wine before the meal, before the end of the meal. So you drink it then? I mean, you could recite the bracha benching on it. So the simple understanding is, what he's saying is you don't need to bench on a cup of wine. It's not an obligation. And so it's not that you should drink it before, it's that you don't have to. But there is another way of understanding it, possibly, and that is that Beis Shammai follows the logic that you're supposed to drink during a meal. And if you didn't drink anything during the meal, your benching is not on a biblical level an obligation, because in order to bench, you need to eat and drink. And we had such a view earlier on that benching, eating is v'achalta v'savata zushsia. You remember that eating is first you eat and then you have to drink in order to bench. So it could be Beis Shammai follows that other view that you're really supposed to drink. And therefore he says better to drink before the benching and not bench on a cup of wine, because this way your benching will be, you'll have fulfilled the biblical obligation of benching, and you'll bench on a biblical level and fulfill the biblical mitzvah, biblical commandment of benching with a cup of wine. So that's another way of interpreting Beis Shammai, give a little understanding of why he's telling you not to bench with a cup of wine, when it would seem like that would be the ideal way to bench. Okay, so that basically brings us up to the next Gemara. There is actually one more thing that I wanted to go over, and that was, we did speak a little about benching with a cup of wine, and we mentioned that Taisus has a question, why don't you recite the bracha of the wine before the benching like you do for Kiddush? And I mentioned, we mentioned it yesterday, that Taisus answers that if you recite the bracha Berpei Hagafen before the benching, you'll end up interrupting Hesech Hadas. You'll have your mind will wander, and you won't end up concentrating on the wine. But by Kiddush and Havdalah, we're not worried about that. So for Kiddush and Havdalah, you say the blessing on the wine first, and then you say the blessing of the Kiddush or the blessing of the Havdalah. It's not a problem. The benching, it is a problem. If you recite a bracha Berpei Hagafen and then you bench, your benching is somehow going to be an interruption. Your mind is going to wander off. So Taisus gives a little more explanation to it. I didn't go into it yesterday. I just want to add what Taisus says over here, and that is that when you're reciting Kiddush or reciting Havdalah, both of these ceremonies, rituals, they are permitting you to eat or to drink. They're giving you by saying Kiddush, now you're going to have a meal. Now you actually have to have a meal after Kiddush. You're not supposed to eat or drink before Kiddush. You're not supposed to eat or drink before Havdalah. So by reciting Havdalah, you are now becoming permitted to you're now able to eat or drink afterwards. In Kiddush, you actually have to eat afterwards. Now, when it comes to Berachas Hamazon, the blessing of the grace after meal, the whole concept of the blessing of grace after meal is that you're ending your meal. So your mind is thinking about stopping the meal. And here you said a bracha bar pe'agafen, but the benching is actually a conclusion of the meal. So therefore, your mind is not on the wine, it's actually on ending the meal. So therefore, it would be considered an interruption if you said the bar pe'agafen before the benching. And therefore, even though for Kiddush and for Havdalah, we say the blessing on the wine first, and it's not an interruption. And afterwards, you drink the wine afterwards, even after you say a few other blessings. But it doesn't apply when it comes to the benching, the blessing of wine before the bench. You wouldn't be able to say the blessing of wine before the benching. You would have to say it after the blessing. So the bottom line is the benching would cause there to be an interruption. Yes, Robert.
I've been trying to read the text and I may have missed it, but I was always taught that Havdalah is the ceremony that separates the profane from the mundane, the holiness of the Sabbath. So wouldn't that take precedent over then doing anything else, whether the blessing over wine or any other activity? Once you conclude the Havdalah service, you're then going into the week. So I don't know if that's a consideration or not, if that makes sense.
So, yeah, well, you're asking a very good question. And the reason why it's a good question is because there was some logic involved when we spoke about Kiddush. We tried to explain what would the reason be to say the blessing of wine before Kiddush, or say the blessing of the Kiddush before the wine. And one of the explanations was that the blessing for the Kiddush should possibly be first, at least according to Beis Shammai, because the whole drinking of the wine is only is based on the holiness of the day. So if the holiness of the day is what obligates the wine, first you should say the holiness of the day before you would say the blessing on the wine. That was Beis Shammai's reason. Now, according to that, when it comes to Havdalah, what is the reason you're drinking the wine? So if you want to say, well, the whole wine is only because of the holiness of the day, so then maybe you would say the same thing should apply to Havdalah, that the holiness of the day is what obligates the wine. So you would say, well, you're separating so that would logically be the case. And the Gemara went through a whole series over there of proving that Beis Shammai, asking this question, that Beis Shammai seems to be the one who says that for Havdalah, you say the wine first. The Gemara, the Gemara dealt with that. It said, logically, you should say the Havdalah first and then the wine, right? So the conclusion of the Gemara was that when it comes to bringing in Shabbos, we want to do the holiness of the day first. When it comes to ending, pushing off the holiness of the day, we want to say the Havdalah blessing last. So even though logically you are correct, Robert, that it should be the other way, but because of pushing, we don't want to push off Shabbos, we don't want to end Shabbos early, so therefore we do it the opposite way. So your point is a valid point. That's why that was a basis almost of the Gemara's discussion earlier. This was a Gemara from before, from yesterday and the day before. Okay, so anyway, the conclusion. So we're now up to a new piece of Gemara, and the new piece of Gemara is talks about Tumah and Tahara. Tumah and Tahara are things that we generally don't consider so practical, because nowadays everyone is really Tameh, and this is the least studied area of the Gemara, because it's generally it's not so applicable. People can't relate to it. You have to understand, in the olden days, they were always nervous of making truma tameh, or touching something holy. So they in those days, it was a very serious thing, tuma and tahara. Nowadays, even in the time of the Gemara, it was already not as popular, because they lived outside of Israel. So they didn't have the holies, they didn't have the truma, and therefore it was less of an issue than it was in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So on the one hand, when they study this in the yeshivas, it's sort of considered like the boring topic, because it's so not practical. On the other hand, believe it or not, the reason we wash our hands before davening has to do with before benching. Why do we wash our hands before benching? Before eating bread, has to do with Tumah and Tahara. So it has to do, so it does have a very practical application, these laws, with regard to washing our hands before we eat a meal. And so we're gonna start this Gemara, even though, again, you're gonna learn a few new points over here regarding the laws of Tumah and Tahara. It's gonna be part of the package of studying this. It may not be the most enjoyable, but keep in mind it is one page, so we'll get over it. So the Gemara brings the Mishnah. The Gemara starts with the statement from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that Beis Shammai said that you wash your hands and afterwards you pour the cup of wine. And Beis Hillel said you pour wine and afterwards you wash your hands. Now, so the question in the Mishnah seemingly was, when do you wash your hands? Now, the simple understanding is we're not necessarily talking about Shabbos, even during the week. You're having a cup of wine. You're gonna wash your hands for bread. Should you wash them before you drink the wine, or after you drink the wine? Now, we know what we do. At least most of us, we say Kiddush on Shabbos, and then we wash our hands for bread. But this law is not necessarily talking about Shabbos, but it's saying in general, you would wash, according to Beis Shammai, you would do it the opposite. You would actually wash your hands before drinking wine. Again, it doesn't have to be Kiddush wine, even just drinking wine before a meal, which was common in those days. They would drink wine before a meal. So they would you could either wash your hands before the wine or after the wine. So the Gemara, the Mishnah mentioned an argument. Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai said you wash your hands before the wine. Beis Hillel says no, you wash your hands after the wine. And now the wine, it's not only talking about drinking the wine, it's also talking about mixing the wine. Moizgen is the pouring and mixing, and as we know that in the olden days they used to mix the wine with water and then drink it. So you would wash your hands, and then moizgen as a kais, then you would pour and mix the wine. And Beis Hillel says you pour and mix the wine, and then you wash your hands for the meal. So what is this argument? So Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned. Let me tell you where we are. We are on the first wide line of the Gemara on page 52a. It must be about 10 lines up from the bottom of the page. It is the first wide line. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a brisa, Tosefta, and it says as follows. Beis Shammai Yomer, Beis Shammai says, "Neidlim le'yodayim b'yachikach moizdim." Esakos. You wash your hands first, and afterwards you pour and mix the wine and drink it. Because if you will say that you should pour the cup first and then wash your hands, gezerah, there should be a decree. In other words, there should be a worry that Shema Yatamu Mashkin, that maybe the liquids that are on the outside of the cup, they will become impure, machmas yadav, because of your hands. V'yachzaru v'yatamu es hakois, and they will go back and end up returning the impurity to the cup. Now, that sounds like Chinese almost. What exactly are we talking about over here? So what happens is that the Torah tells us that there's a lot of things that will make a person impure. A dead body, certain animals that are dead are impure. A person who has tzaras is impure. Someone who's a zav, he has an emission. Some type of an emission is impure. A woman could be impure. There are different types of impurities. Now, the impurities, the way it works is there's the source of the impurity, and then there's the recipient of the impurity. So there's something called an avatoma, like a person who touches a dead body, he becomes like a source of impurity. The dead body itself is called avia voisatoma, but the person who touches it is called an avatoma, or person, or a dead animal. Certain animals that are dead, they would be called an avatoma, a source of sheretz. They would be considered a source of tuma. Now, anything that touches it would be a recipient of tuma. Now, when it comes to recipients of tuma, there's different levels. There's level 1 recipient, and then when that recipient touches something else, that becomes a level 2 recipient. Now, when level 2 recipient touches truma, he actually ruins the truma. Truma becomes a level 3 recipient. However, what happens if the recipient, the level 2, touches not truma, just regular food? Then we say it's no longer tummy. This number 2 truma, number 2 tuma, a level 2 of impurity. If a person is a recipient, number 2, he does not make other foods impure. It doesn't go further than that. When it comes to truma, he could go a little further. He can make a 3rd level tame, impure. But when it comes to regular mundane foods, it doesn't go further than a 2nd degree, a 2nd level. So again, we have the av hatuma, the source of the tuma. Then we have the recipient number 1. And then we have what the recipient number 1 touches. If the recipient number 1 touches something else, that other thing becomes recipient number 2. So that's called a sheni. So we have a rishon l'tuma and a sheni l'tuma. Neither of these are sources. They're not the source of the tuma. The avatuma is really the source. But the first level can make other things tame because he is recipient number 1, and he can cause something else to be a recipient level 2. That's the laws from the Torah. The rabbis added some rules. One rule that the rabbis added is that your hands are always considered level 2, recipient level 2. That's one rule. Hands are called shniyos. They're called 2nd level tumah. Another rule the rabbi said is a big issue when a zav or a zava, if let's say they spit on something, let's say they're talking and the saliva comes out, or their spit falls on something, or other liquids, that is considered an av hatumah. That's a source of tumah. The rabbis wanted us to be aware of that we have to be careful of liquids, because because of the liquid, because of the roik, the spit of a zav and a zava, and because of that, the rabbi said any liquid is going to be more strict. And they said that liquids, if a level 2 touches a liquid, it actually can become tamei. Not only does it become impure, but it becomes impure called a level 1. That sounds surprising. So again, you have the sheretz, the dead animal, that's a avatuma. It touches, let's say it touches a vessel. The vessel becomes a rishon l'tumah, becomes a first level tumah. That vessel touches chocolate chip cookie. The chocolate chip cookie now becomes a level 2 recipient of impurity. Now that chocolate chip cookie touches some orange juice that's spilled on the table. Guess what? That orange juice that's on the table now becomes a level 1 recipient of tumah, and it can go and cause other foods to become impure. So for example, if you then put on a loaf of bread on the table and it touches that orange juice, that bread will now become a level 2 recipient of tumah. So what we've learned here so far is that biblically, there's all you have is the source of tumah, and then you have recipient number 1, recipient number 2, and that's it. It doesn't matter. You touch liquids, you touch solids, that's it. It's over. Recipient number 2 cannot go and cause anything else to be tamei. However, rabbinically, there are some extra rules. One is that your hands are called second recipient level 2 tumahs. And additionally, liquids, when they're touched by a level 2 tumah, they actually become a level 1 tumah. They could become impure, which is surprising, but it has to do with the fact that we are comparing it to the liquids of a tamei person who sometimes have a rule of a source of tumah, and therefore we want to give some awareness to the fact that liquids can carry a very serious level tumah. So we give them a very stringent rule, and we remind people by saying liquids mashkin are now level 2 of mashkin could be a level 1. They become level 1s, even if they're touched by a level 2. So you would think they should be called a level 3, which there is no such thing, no category of level 3. The rabbi said, no, they become a level 1. They go back a level. They go up a level. So that is more or less the rules that you need to know in order to understand this Gemara. So now let me tell you what Beis Shammai says. Beis Shammai said over here that you should wash your hands first before you pour the wine on the cup. And the reason they're so nervous is you have to understand that Beis Shammai holds you're not allowed to use a tamei cup. You can't use a tamei cup, a cup that's tamei, during a meal. Beis Hillel argues and says it's no problem. You're allowed to use a tamei cup. A cup that's tamei. Now, what I mean by a cup that's tamei is a cup that the outside is tamei, but the inside is tahar. You're allowed to use such a cup. According to Beis Shammai, you're not allowed to. According to Beis Hillel, you're allowed to. Again, it's a strange scenario. Again, this is rabbinic laws where a person could be divided in half, where your hands are tamei and your body is not tamei, but your hands are called shniyos, right? This is rabbinic. So we also have this concept of a cup. A cup could be considered tamei, where the outside will be tamei, but the inside not. So this again would be a rabbinic law that the cup would be considered a certain type of tumah, that would be the outside of it would be tamei, and the inside would not be tamei. And this is a unique law. Biblically, you wouldn't have such a thing, and but rabbinically, a vessel could become tamei from a liquid, and that's what our brisa Beis Shammai is talking about. So let's think about this. Beis Shammai says I want you to wash your hands before you pour the wine. Why? Because I'm nervous that the cup of wine that you're going to pour if you don't wash your hands, what happens? Your hands are really called secondary level recipients of tumah, right? Your hands are number 2 level tumah. What happens if they touch liquid? The liquid now becomes a level 1. That level 1 tumah is now going to touch the cup, and that cup is now going to be considered a rabbinically tameh. And therefore, the Beis Shammai says, you got to wash your hands first, because if you wash your hands first, your hands are not called second level recipients of tumah because you wash them. You wash them now. If they touch water, they're not going to make the water tameh. And if the water touches the cup is not going to be tameh, and you'll be able to drink from the cup during the meal. So Beis Shammai is nervous. If you don't wash your hands first, the cup might be wet. You're going to touch the cup. Guess what's going to happen? The cup is going to become tameh because you touched the wet cup. That liquid that's on the outside of the cup is going to now become a level 1 tumah. Why? Because your hands were never washed, and your hands were a level 2 tumah. But a level 2 tumah can, according to rabbinic law, they can make liquids into a level 1 tumah, and that level 1 tumah will now make the cup rabbinically a level 2 tumah, and it'll become tameh, and you won't be allowed to drink from. You shouldn't be drinking from a cup that's tameh during a meal. So the Beis Shammai says, therefore, wash your hands first before a meal, before drinking wine, before pouring the wine, because I'm nervous you're going to make the cup tameh. Let's read it inside. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in the Brisa and the Tosefta. Beis Shammai says, Neitlim le'yadayim, you have to wash your hands. Netilas yadayim, like we do for bread. And afterwards, you pour the wine and drink the cup. Because if you will say, you should pour the cup first without washing your hands. Gezerah, there is reason to make a decree because Shema Yatamu, maybe the liquid, Shema Yatamu Mashkin, maybe the liquid will become impure. That's on the outside of the cup. It was washed, let's say, and it wasn't dried. And maybe that's going to become tami machmas yado because of your hands. Your hands are a level 2 tumah, and they're going to now make the water that's considered a level 1 tumah. They're gonna make it into a level 1 tumah. And then it'll then go and make the cup tameh. And because the cup it maybe is wet from when it was washed, or possibly there's some liquid from the cup that's on the outside of it's spritzed out maybe to the outside of the cup. Maybe it's spilled a little. So somehow we're nervous that you're going to now make it tameh, and Beis Shammai holds that when you're not allowed to use a tameh cup for the meal. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say I can see that your hands are always tameh, because I see even people that wash their hands before they eat, they still play with their beard or whatever they do while they're eating, they make their hand tameh again. But because you touched your beard before you washed and you touch your beard after you wash. So I think Shammai is right by wash your hands first, because that's where the tumah starts.
Well, I don't know if the beard is tameh. The beard is one of the holiest parts of the body.
I don't think the tumah would start from the cup. As Hillel says, what? I didn't hear, I'm sorry.
No, you were breaking up.
The beard is the holiest part of the body?
Yeah. The beard is the source of all the 13 attributes of mercy.
I am saying that your hands, I understand that, but still, if you touched your beard, if you have a ziva and you touched your beard catches something from your hands.
No.
Ziva is not a drip from your mouth.
No, we're not talking about a Zav himself.
It's talking
Eating it,
about
but-
something else.
We're not talking about a Zav is eating a meal. We're talking about a regular person is eating a meal. And you're mentioning a person who's tummy with Zav. He is, his whole body is tummy. That's a different story.
Right.
We're talking about a regular person that the rabbis just decreed on
Right.
regular people that your
But
hands should be tummy.
how do you know that the guy next to you? How do you know the guy next to you doesn't have ziva?
Right. So you do have to be careful. In the olden days, they were actually very careful who they shook hands with, and it was not a simple thing. And it was a very serious thing. They had to be careful who if they're becoming tamei or not, But let's do base Hillel, because now we're up to base Hillel. Before we do base Hillel, the Gemara has just a few questions on Beis Shammai. The Gemara says, the Gemara asks, what about your hands? Your hands are number 2 level tuma. They're recipient number 2. So why aren't your hands causing the cup from to be tamei when they touch it? So the Gemara answers, the Gemara answers, Yadayim Shniyah is saying the hands are number 2. Bein Sheni is a shlishi b'chulin. The 2 can't make a number 3. There's no such thing. The 2 doesn't make a number 3 tamei. So a cup that's not it's not a holy cup. It's not a truma cup. It's not it's not like truma food that would be tamei level 3 would actually, there would be another level of tuma, but it's the cup is just a regular cup. So it would be able to become a number. It would be able to become tamei, but it can't be tamei from hands that are number 2. A sheni doesn't make a shlishi with chulin, but ella al yedei mashkin. The only way it could do it is through liquid. So it's that your hands are going to make the liquid into a number 1 tuma, and that number 1 tuma will then be able to cause the cup to become tamei and give it a level 2 of tuma. Now, so that's Beis Shammai's understanding. Now, what does Beis Hillel say? Beis Hillel says, you pour the cup, and then afterwards wash your hands. Now, what's Beis Hillel's logic? What happens if you wash your hands first? Gezerah, we're nervous. Maybe your hands will become tamei because your cup is tamei. And that tuma will then make your hands tamei. So if you wash your hands first, you're going to ending off with being tamei anyway. Why? Because you might be using a tamei cup. Because Beis Hillel holds you're allowed to use cups that are tamei. And therefore, if you end up washing your hands first, now your hand's going to be wet. Now, if your hands is wet, what's going to happen when it touches the cup that's tamei? The cup is going to make the liquid that are on your hands tamei into a level 1 tuma. And the liquid will now make your hands tamei shniyos. They'll now be tamei level 2 tuma. And what's going to happen is that you're going to be eating bread without washing your hands, and you're going to be eating with a level 2 of tuma. So Beis Hillel was worried about washing your hands first. They'll end up ending off that it's as if you didn't wash your hands. Now, the reason, the source of this argument is Beis Shammai holds the cup can't be tamei in the first place because you're not allowed to use a tamei cup to eat your meal with. So the only worry, according to Beis Shammai, is that your hands will end up ruining the cup. That's what Beis Shammai is worried about. Beis Hillel is worried the opposite. I'm not worried about the cup becoming tamei. The cup is tamei, probably. Might be tamei. I'm worried about you becoming tamei from the cup. That's what they're worried about. So what it boils down to is that water, liquid, has the ability to make things more tamei than they started out to be. And your hands could possibly make water on the cup tamei, and then the water will make the cup tamei.
Rabbi?
Or the cup might make the water on your hands tummy, and though that water might make your hands now tummy. So this is the statement of Beis Hillel. Of course, the Gemara has a question. Why can't the cup make your hands tummy in the first place? Why does it need liquid? Why are you worried that your hands will be wet? What's the big deal? Your hands are going to be your hands will be wet. Why are you worried about that? Even if they're not wet, let the cup is tummy. It's going to make your hands tummy. The Gemara answers, "Ein kli metame adam." A vessel can't make a person tummy. Only it could make the liquid tummy. Can't make a person tummy. The Gemara asks, now, the Gemara now asks a question on Beis Hillel. So just to summarize, before we do this new question, just to summarize. So we have Beis Shammai who wants you to be having a meal with a pure cup. He says you have to have your meal with a pure cup. So he holds that you have to do whatever is within your ability to make sure that that cup stays pure. And the way to do that is if you wash your hands first, then your hands will be pure. They're no longer called shniyos, second level recipient impure. They're not called that anymore because you washed them. And then, even if the cup is wet now, the wetness will not become tummy because your hands have been washed. And then the wetness will not make the cup tummy. But if you didn't wash your hands, then possibly your hands will make the wetness of the cup tummy, level 1. And that level 1 will cause the cup to become a level 2 of tumah, at least the outside of it. Now, Beis Hillel looks at it the opposite way. Beis Hillel says, we're not worried about a cup getting tummy because you're allowed to eat a meal with a cup that's tummy. In fact, he says the main issue that you have is not making your hands tummy. And if that's the issue, Beis Hillel says that we have to be worried that if that cup is tummy, then the liquid on your hands, if you wash them, you're going to actually be defeating the purpose of washing your hands. Because you're washing your hands because you want to get rid of the level 2 tumah that's on people's hands. But keep in mind that that level 2 tumah that's on people's hands is coming right back to you after you wash them because the cup is tummy. It's going to make the liquid that's on the cup tummy. The liquid that's on the cup, that's on your hands tummy. Beis Hillel is worried about liquid that's on your hands. If you wash your hands, your hands might be a little wet. So you're going to have liquid that's on your hands. That's going to be tummy, that you're going to get tummy because the cup is tummy. So then what's that liquid going to do? It's going to now continue and make your hands tummy because your hands are touching that liquid. This is the liquid on your hands. The hand liquid is the number 1 recipient tumah. That means your hands are going to be a level 2 recipient tumah. They're back to square 1. They're back to where they were. So when you washed your hands first, you gained 0. So according to Beis Hillel, better wash your hands afterwards. Now, the question that Ezra is probably going to ask is, if you wash your hands afterwards, what do you gain? During the meal, your hands are going to be wet again. That's not his question. Okay, what's your question, Ezra?
So, people didn't have towels to dry their hands?
No, they did dry their hands. But so let me answer your question and answer my question as well at the same time. The law is that when you wash your hands for bread, you have an obligation to dry your hands. There's statements about it. I believe we even learned such a statement. If a person eats without drying their hands, it's like you ate tamei bread. I think there were some negative statements about it. In other words, a person is obligated to dry their hands for a meal. However, if you're washing your hands for wine, it doesn't say anywhere that you're obligated to dry them properly. So for a meal, people were extra careful to dry them because there's statements about how important it is to dry your hands for a meal, but for bread. So before they eat bread, you make sure to eat bread with dry hands. But if you're washing before drinking wine, that washing, at that point, you're not drying your hands necessarily perfectly because it doesn't say anything about drying your hands before you drink a cup of wine. It's not like the biggest sin. It's not. It's before eating bread, people were careful, extra careful to dry their hands. So before drinking a cup of wine, the Beis Hillel says people might not dry their hands so perfectly, and if you don't dry your hands so well, it's going to end up that you're going to cause your hands to become tamei again, and therefore better don't wash until you're ready to do the bread. When you're ready to eat the bread, that's when you should really be washing and drying your hands properly.